Welcome, and thanks for joining us for the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast, where we discuss Christian apologetics, worldviews, and so much more. We're so glad that you're listening with us today. Feel free to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell to keep up with all the latest news over at RSA. Now, on to today's podcast episode.
Welcome to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast. I am Micah, and joining me today is Dr. Andy Bannister. Andy Bannister is the director of the Solas Center for Public Christianity. He speaks and teaches regularly throughout the UK, Europe, Canada, and the United States, and all throughout the wider world. Dr. Bannister also holds a PhD in Quranic studies. Welcome back to the world's one and only apologetic satire podcast, Dr. Bannister.
It is great to be here. It feels like I've hardly been away at all. And since I'm here, I was here last time, you've doubled. Last time it was just Will, and now it's you, Micah. So it's great to be back.
Well, I've been reading your book, Dr. Bannister. You're
very brave.
Your latest. Oh, it's brilliant. How to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot. I slipped up today when I was talking at Bible study. I mispronounced the title, How to Talk to Jesus Without Looking Like an Idiot, which is
that's a good book. Oh, yes, that book needs to be written, I suppose. That's a book on prayer for dummies, right?
Right. And what struck me originally was the title or the cover art, Don't Panic. Was there a little of Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy in there?
Oh, that inspires me with confidence, because I was thinking that kind of level, that humor would work, for my generation, like, sort of 40s and 50s. But yeah, you got it. They're sort of very much so. And if you read the acknowledgements at the back, it's explicitly so. So yeah, I'm a massive Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy fan. Love Douglas Adams, grew up with that kind of stuff. And I love the idea of don't panic. And I think, yes, for people who know Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy had the words don't panic on the front in large friendly letters. And I thought someone needs to write an apologetics book, an evangelism book with the words don't panic on the front in large friendly letters. I tried to persuade my publisher that, if you bought 3 copies, you get a free towel if you really know your Hitchhiker's Guide. But that didn't work. So, yeah, we are.
Did the humorous footnote that you have at the end, that if people don't read the footnotes, they really need to, did that come from Douglas Adams, or was that Terry Pratchett, or where did that come from?
I don't know. There's all kinds of humor in there. You've got Douglas Adams is an influence in there. Terry Pratchett is definitely an influence in there. In terms of kind of, I think The Princess Bride turns up in there. I think for people who love kind of British humor, there's lots of British sort of references in there. I think Mr. Bean and Rowan Atkinson turn up in there in a few places. I think Red Dwarf, which is a sci-fi comedy, turns up in there. So yeah, if you like British humor and sort of British sort of fun comedy stuff, you will find all kinds of references. Oh, and I love sci-fi too. So Doctor Who turns up in a few places too.
I think Douglas Adams has something to do with Doctor Who at one point.
He was the script editor at some point. He was the script editor for Doctor Who, and wrote several episodes. In fact, including a famously not finished episode called Sharda, which was cancelled due to a strike at the BBC. So, but they've reanimated that now using sort of drawings. So this is getting very geeky, isn't it? So yes, there is a Doctor Who and Douglas Adams reference there.
Well, tell us about the phenomenon of the undercover Christian, and I don't mean that hit television show that's never been made. I mean,
well, there ought to be, oughtn't it? There's a TV show that's been made there. So the undercover Christian, that's the title of the first chapter, and as you'll know because you read it, as all people should, and that really is a term I coined to describe when I was now I'm full time in ministry. But when I started out, my first job was working for a local hospital. Did that for 6 years, doing conference management. Loved it. But I really realized, looking back, that I was, as I say, an undercover Christian. So outside of work, very involved in church and all kinds of things. Inside work, kept my faith to myself. Took my little light of faith and stuffed it under a bowl, basically, and hid my faith away. And I think I was afraid, basically. Well, I was afraid of talking about my faith at work. Afraid of looking like an idiot. Afraid of just not knowing what to say, afraid of not knowing how to answer questions, afraid of making God look bad, quite frankly. So I said nothing. So in one sense, this book is the book that I wish I'd had when I was like 25 years old. If I could find a way of sending it back through a wormhole or something without destroying the whole of causality in the process, then we would do that.
So let's dive into that a little bit more. How do we deal with what you call in the book the flip-flops of fear, the socks of silence, and the underpants of uncertainty, and gain more confidence in sharing our faith? What's the game plan for doing that?
Well, the best game plan, I would say, is to buy that yellow book. That is the best game plan, Will. And if you haven't got space on your bookshelf because it's taken up with other books, like, say, Greg Kokel's books, throw those out. I mean, Greg's all right, but if you've only got room for one book, you want the yellow one. And if he was in the room, he would probably say the opposites. No, very seriously, I think a couple of things. First thing you can do is, I think, identify your fears. Sometimes when we say we're afraid of sharing our faith, it's too broad. So it's worth trying to figure out what are the exact fears. What is it that we're afraid of? Because if you're specific, you can deal with it. And the example I give in the book, I used to be afraid of flying. Trouble is, that's far too general. And it was actually when a friend who was a pilot helped me with this and helped me diagnose that my actual fear was control. I had to be in control. If I wasn't in control, I didn't like not being in control. And when I identified that, I was able to deal with the flying thing. So what is the exact fear when it comes to evangelism? That can help. Second thing I think that can help is realizing that evangelism is not a solo sport. If you've got it in your head that you have to go out on your own, unsupported, and share your faith at school, university, among your mates, at work, wherever, that's going to be tough because it's very, very lonely. But I think realizing that evangelism is a team sport, not a solo sport. If there are other, Christians on your course or university, find ways of working together. Even if it's just that there's no other Christians around you, but you can share what you're doing with your friends at church, so that you're praying together and you know that you're not on your own. So don't do it on your own is number two. And then thirdly, and perhaps that's the most edgy that I go into in the book, is that there's also a spiritual issue here, because often our fears reveal where our idols lay. Like, if you're afraid of something, very often it can mean that's the thing that's controlling you. And for some of us, I think sort of social reputation, having nice, comfortable lives, has become a little bit of an idol. Actually. And so if that's the case, addressing that, bringing that before the Lord, praying that through. And then the rest of the book really is designed to teach some very, very, very practical tools to help you get into sharing your faith. Because I joked about Greg Kokel. I know you've had Greg on the show. Greg and I, known each other on and off occasionally over the years. One of the things I notice is books like Tactics, that's his book, and there is other stuff out there, Bill Craig, great stuff. The entry level is quite high. If you are somebody who has never thought about sharing your faith, you wouldn't know the word apologetics, even with the help of a dictionary, you'd struggle with that. Where do you start? I wanted to write a book that's very, very entry level and very, very practical and hands-on. And hopefully, joking aside, one of my goals would be that if people read my book and get into this kind of stuff a bit, then they'll be ready to read Greg Kokel and C.S. Lewis and Randy Newman and all that other stuff. So I partly hope that the yellow book will be a gateway drug to other books.
So another key part was questions, and there's 4 specific questions we should be asking.
Yes.
We dive into those.
Yeah. So the first question you should be asking is, have I bought a copy of the Idiot book? And if I haven't, should I? And maybe another question would be, I wonder what Will's bank details are, because then he might buy the book for me. No, the 4 questions I teach in the book. The first 2 are what I call the what question and the why question. None of this stuff is unique to me. Others have gone over this ground. So Greg Kokel's book Tactics, but then Greg's stuff isn't new. He's just recycling stuff that's been done for decades. So all of us in one sense is nothing new under the sun. So the what question simply teaches you that when you're confronted by someone raising an objection to your faith, this is the common way you can use this. Look for an opportunity, sort of say, well, what do you mean by that? So if somebody says, there's no evidence that God exists, great way in is go, that's a really interesting comment. What do you mean by evidence, for example? But you could use it even more simply. If somebody says to you, any kind of question about your faith, a great starting point is, what leads you to ask that question? Why that particular question? I'm really intrigued why you've asked that. So the what question digs a little bit deeper into what people are asking. And then got the why question that's not dissimilar. Really with the why question, you're asking somebody to give you the reasons for for their skepticism. And again, not new to me. This goes back to Francis Schaeffer and much further back. But again, if somebody, sort of says, oh, I can't trust the Bible, it's unreliable or whatever, before you leap into giving your 45-minute, apologetic lecture, simply slowing it down and saying, that's really interesting. Why do you think that? What is it that you've read or seen or heard that's led you to that conclusion? That can be very helpful. Those two, I think lots of people have covered that, but I wanted to get those in there in my own way, in super accessible, hopefully very funny way. But for me, the really key question in this book is the third question, which I don't think has been nearly enough worked on, and that's what I call the wandering question. Because the what question, the why question, some of the sort of tactics type stuff that I know you guys have talked about, that's great if someone's got an objection. But if someone's got nothing, if you're dealing with somebody who is just not interested, there's been a lot of talk about the rise of the nuns, not the N-U-N-S, the N-O-N-E-S, people who would say to you, I don't care about religion, not interested. And you say, oh, what about Christianity? And their answer is not to give you an objection. They're just like, I'm not interested. I just don't care. Doesn't interest me at all. You can wave what and why questions around until the cows come home, but it doesn't help because they're not objecting. But you can learn to ask wandering questions. And I think the model for that comes from the Bible, actually. So in Acts 17, there's that really interesting passage where Paul's in Athens, and we're told he wanders around Athens. He sees the statues and the idols and the pagan polytheistic paraphernalia. And rather than get upset, which you might expect, he's a Jew by background, you'd expect him to get really angry. He doesn't. He goes to the Areopagus and he starts preaching, and he says, I saw your temples and your statues, and I was so impressed. I was really impressed how religious and spiritual you lot are. And then I saw this altar, marked to an unknown God. And that got me wondering. Who is this God that you guys are praying to? It's really interesting. Have you thought about this? Let me show you with you who I think it is. And off he goes. And we can do exactly the same thing in our culture. And that may not be with unknown gods, but for example, the big ones, is justice. If you've got someone who doesn't believe in God and isn't interested, but they care about justice or rights or human dignity or racism or oppression, whatever it is, what a way is the opportunity to look for a chance to go, hey, I'm really impressed that you care about justice, but hey, I've wondered, how do we decide what justice is? Why does justice matter to you? If we live in a universe where there is no God and everything is just matter and motion, why does justice matter? Have you wondered about that? And the wandering question, I think, is such an absolutely brilliant way in to starting spiritual conversations with people who otherwise you would have no foot in the door. And so for me, that's the most thing in the book I'm the most excited about. And as I say, that's a really ancient one because it goes right back to the Apostle Paul, arguably even further goes to Jesus, actually. But really, we see it in Paul. And what I found when I've taught the material in this book, and I've taught it to tens of thousands of people now, if not more, so often I hear feedback that it's that wandering question that is the light bulb moment for people of going, okay, now I can see a way that I might try and start conversations with friends and neighbors and colleagues.
And natural curiosity is a good conversation starter. I mean, especially if you just are naturally curious. Because I'm often curious about my classmates. So I wonder what you believe. I wonder why you believe it. And especially if it's actually genuine, it's not just trap questions. You get interesting conversation started.
Yeah, and by the way, is to go. Yeah, I mean, if they believe stuff, obviously there's a great in there. So, for example, if I meet somebody of another faith, for example, if you meet a Muslim or a Hindu or a Buddhist, just start by wondering. Go, hey, it's fascinating. Tell me more about what you believe. I'm really interested, and ask lots of questions. But even if someone isn't identifying as any kind of belief, I think curiosity. I think you're dead right. That's a really good word. And a really good thing to cultivate, because whatever your friend is into, if you start with curiosity, if they're into, I don't know, sort of sport or film or, taxidermy or something, if they're into taxidermy, rather than say get stuffed, it's a terrible dad joke there. You could just take an interest and say, how did you get into that? And why does that matter to you? And what fascinates you? And the more that you take an interest and show curiosity, I think a couple of things will happen. Firstly, that it increases the chance that you'll find that spiritual connection, just like Paul did in Athens. The more that you listen and you're quietly praying as they talk, the more chance that you'll find a way to go, you know, this really interests me. And then you'll find a bridge across to something spiritual. But even if you don't immediately, the more you take an interest, it increases the chance that they'll say, so what are you into? And, you know, and they'll ask about your life, and you can say, well, I'm glad you asked. I'm into British comedy because it really matters. I like sci-fi, you know, I like rock climbing, and, you know, church is a big part of my life. Those are kind of things I spend my time doing. And you've just normalized church in that answer, by the way. I'm not a weird. You've listed some things that they'll recognize, and then you've thrown that in. And if you've taken the time to be curious about them, and you've shown you're someone who listens and is interesting and interested, it does say increase the chance they're likely to go, so what church? You know, I mean, do young people go to church or something? And you can go, well, it's funny you ask, my church is stuff full of young people or something. So curiosity, I agree with you. I think curiosity is a really important thing to cultivate.
This is a side note, but we did an article a while back on a list of things that the nuns believe, satirical. But it was a spoof on the name nun because it's really accurate. Where did the universe come from? Nothing. What's the point of life? No point. What gets you out of the bed in the morning? Nothing. Where does morality come from? Nowhere. What do we know about God? Nothing. Where are we going? Nowhere. And the list kind of goes.
Yeah. The only thing I just be cheeky because it's gone 9 o'clock at night and I'm feeling belligerent, as we Brits tend to. I think there can be an element of truth in that. Just a couple of things to be careful on. While I don't disagree at all, and that is quite funny, and I like it. I like a wordplay as much as the next fundamentalist. Yeah, in some cases that is what's going on, and I think it's fun to play with it slightly. Two things to be aware of. Firstly, is we need to be very careful in apologetics not to come across as jerks. I'm not saying you would, but sometimes, you know, we can be a bit quick. Social media, this can sometimes happen where, you know, because atheists like to meme, Christians start memeing back. And to go, if we're not careful, we get a bit flippant. So I think just being careful, because if you're dealing with a belligerent atheist, have some fun. I mean, by all means, you can go. But for those who are the nun category, quite a lot of those are not actually atheists, which is really interesting. So I don't know the survey data for the US, but the 2021 UK census, so the survey on, you know, sort of the UK population that we have the latest data for, something like 22 million people here in the UK ticks the none box for religion, because we survey, that's one of the survey questions, they ticked that. But there was an opportunity to specify what you meant, and I think only about 12,000 people wrote atheist, 10,000 people wrote humanist, and 14,000 people wrote could be bothered to write agnostic, which tells me I think none is a category for a lot of people who are like, well, I'm not atheist, but I'm definitely not Christian. I definitely aren't Muslim. I don't know what I believe, but perhaps I've got a problem with organized religion. I don't like, you know, the religion and the way it gets tied up with politics and all the other mess going on. So I'll tick that box. And I had a really interesting you know, sort of introduction to. I told this story in the book that 2-3 years ago I was fishing with a friend on a loch in Scotland, on a lake in Scotland, and we'd hired a fishing guide to go out for the day and catch some fish. And as he motored us out into the middle of the lake, we got chatting, and he asked my friend, "What do you do?" My friend was a vicar. My friend's a minister. So my friend went, "I'm a Church of England vicar. I'm a minister." And he went, "Oh." And then he asked me, "Well, Andy, so what do you do then, Andy?" I said, "Well, I guess I'm a sort of vicar. I'm not a vicar who hasn't got a church." And he went, "Oh, for goodness sake, I'm stuck on a boat for the day with two religious nutters," was what he put it in deep Scottish. And so my friend said, "Oh, so what? I guess you don't believe in God." He went, "Oh, no, don't believe in God, none of that kind of stuff." And then I think one of us said, I can't remember which one of us said, so I think, you know, a few minutes later we chatted a bit more, and then we were baiting the hook with the worms. I said, "I guess since you don't believe in God, I guess ultimately this is our destiny in life, right? To be worm food. So these worms that we're feeding to catch the fish, you know, were previously probably busy munching on a human being. That's the point of life, right? A great cycle of life. It's a bit exciting, isn't it?" The guy looks at us and goes, "Oh no, that's a bit bleak. No, I don't believe that. I mean, that's clearly wrong. There's definitely something when we die." And I was like, so we've gone from none to there's something when we die. And then as we talked further, it sort of basically came out. He just had a horrific experience at church when he was a kid. His mum had dragged him along, and he'd gone to a church that spent half their time dinging people around the head and not letting them ask questions. So he just given it all up in his 20s. But actually, underneath the surface, there was a lot going on. So I think a lot of NONESs are actually in that category. Spiritual but not religious. That's a category I think we need to be aware of, right?
I've seen that as well. I had a friend that thought he was hardcore atheist, but I got to asking him about it. It turns out his mom was abused by the pastor. It's a very, very different category. Mm-hmm. I feel like a lot of people actually, I mean, the nun category, in some senses, I think it's far more prevalent than atheism these days.
Definitely, absolutely, and I think it's a classic. What do you mean by that question? And then the other thing, I can't remember if we talked about this last time, that in the previous book, although I mentioned it in the yellow one, in the Islam book that I did before this one, I introduced sort of 4 questions that you can use to steer a conversation through someone's belief system. And the first question is, do you think there's a God, and if so, what do you think God is like? Now, if someone goes, I'm not interested in God, I don't really believe in God, that's fine, because you can say, okay, fair enough. Second question is, what do you think a human being is? That's a really interesting question, because you can't get off the hook on that one. You can't go, I don't really believe in human beings. That doesn't work. So yeah, what do you think a human being is? Are we just atoms and particles? Is there more to life? Is there a purpose to life? All those questions. So, yeah, I'd love to know what you think. We can toss the God thing to one side, come back to it. And then the third and fourth questions, what do you think's gone wrong with the world? And what do you think is the solution? And I find those 4 questions, the God question, the human question, the what's gone wrong and what's the solution, that's good for cracking open conversations with nuns, really, because what I think you tend to find is you talk about those second, third and fourth questions, they really don't make sense unless there's a God. So you can end up sort of looping back to it.
So let's talk a little bit about the very memorable QWKZE acronym that you.
Yes. That
what is share? What does it stand for, and why isn't it QWKZE?
I love that you've read the footnotes. Well, that's fantastic. I won't spoil the surprise of what that first thing kind of meant, but I think it's quite a funny footnote personally. But
I agree.
The joke about it is that I wanted to teach a series of steps for answering tough questions, because one of the things I do in the book is, okay, once you've learned to ask questions, there does come a point where you need to share something. You can't just ask questions totally. You do actually need at some point to offer something. And I thought to myself, I've got these 5 steps that I've used before. And I thought, I'm going to be very clever. I'm going to come up with a really clever acronym for these 5 steps. And my word, it took me like a day. It was just painful because it was not obvious. And I did cut some really horrendous things, and I got so frustrated at one point. And so there's a footnote to the effect of, what the acronym could have been. Finally, I came up with SHARE was the acronym. And even that, I mean, I think I'm happy with it, but it's a couple of them are a bit forced. But so the idea is, when someone asks you a tough question, why had you believe in God when there's suffering in the world or whatever? For those of us, 2 things can happen. If you know apologetics, for like you and your partner in crime there who know apologetics, it's easy to go, I know the answer. It's a bit like Donkey and Shrek. Pick me, I know the answer. And to go, you dump all this apologetic stuff on your poor friend who asked a question and wanted a conversation, and what they've got is like a 15-minute lecture with footnotes. The other possibility is we don't know apologetics and we don't know our way around something, and someone asks us a question and we freeze, like kind of rabbits in the headlights, and it's like, that's not good either. So I wanted to teach a series of steps that you can go through when someone asks you a question, and it works whether you're in apologetics, like jiu-jitsu, black belt guy or girl, or you don't know a lot. And the SHARE acronym works like this. Step 1 is for sympathize. So first thing you do is you sympathize with a person. So if they ask the suffering question, great to begin by saying something like, you know what, that's a really good question. That's a really good question. And thank you for asking it. And, I have thought about that a lot myself. If you've experienced suffering in your own life, great opportunity to say, do you know what, when crap has happened to me, and it has, you might share some stories of going, I've wrestled with that too. So thank you for that that question. I get why that's a significant question. You might equally say, just I'm interested, why do you ask it? Because it might be important to know, is your friend asking this because they're being theoretical? Or are they asking this because their mum died 4 weeks ago, and they are still red hot grief, and they're just angry with God. So sympathize is the S. H is hidden assumptions. So just like an iceberg has a little bit sticky above the water and lots underneath the water, so with questions. There's often stuff lurking beneath the surface that lies unaddressed. And if we can bring it out, things get interesting. So just on that suffering example, as I know you guys know well, it doesn't make any sense to talk about suffering in a godless universe. What's the problem? Why ask the why question? If it's just nature, suck it up, really. Nature is red in tooth and claw. Why is it we ask those why questions? Why does death feel unnatural? Why do we get angry about injustice? That's a really interesting hidden assumption that's been dragged into the question, that suffering is in fact wrong. A is for apply the Bible. You want to gently draw people into the biblical worldview for a couple of reasons. Firstly, where they're standing isn't going to help them. And secondly, I think as apologists, I like a good argument. But I think I get worried at some apologists I read who the Bible seems to be an afterthought. So try and get them to the Bible. One way of doing it on this question, by the way, is off that assumption to go, it's interesting. One of the things I appreciate about the Bible is in the very first few pages, it recognizes that A, there's suffering and evil, and B, it's not part of the design. Something has gone wrong. And the Bible gives you that framework for actually going, evil and suffering are not part of God's good creation. It wasn't supposed to be that way. And as you read on, you discover more about that. So you can draw people into the story. R is for retell the gospel. And any question we get, well, I'm always asking myself, how do I get to the gospel through this question? I think any answer, any explanation that doesn't begin or end with a cross and with Jesus probably doesn't deserve the title Christian apologetics. It's just showing off, really. So try and find a way to the gospel. And here, of course, on the suffering question, one way I often find to do that is to sort of say, look, when it comes to suffering and evil, what most of us want is something done about the problem, not something said about the problem, because really it just needs action. Injustice and suffering needs action. And the great thing is we've got a God who, in the person of Jesus, has done something. God hasn't just sat up there in heaven and just given us his view on things. He's actually done something. And again, there's a lot you can say there. And then lastly, the E of the SHARE acronym is equip. Equip your friends. So, in a short conversation, you can't cover everything. So the more you can build a little library of, podcasts, YouTube videos, books, resources. So if the conversation goes well, you can say to your friend, hey, this has been really interesting. Look, we've only got so much time. I've got a really good book that I can recommend on this. Would you be interested? One of my friends, actually, I came across recently, I thought was a cracking idea. I need to find the equivalent to this because it works better for women. And I will probably get complaints now that I'm about to be terribly sexist. And so my friend, she's got a whole series of quite small apologetics books that she carries in her handbag. And we guys don't always have the equivalent to the handbag. Maybe got a laptop bag, but a lot of the time we schlep around without something. But find the equivalent because it's a really good ministry. So she says, she has a conversation about suffering. She's always got 3 or 4 little books in her bag on that, because to go, what opportunity to say to somebody, hey, I've got a book that you might enjoy, and then you give them the gift. So equip your friend. So there we are. That's SHARE.
So before we go on to bumper sticker theology, I want to ask
bumper sticker theology
if this is part of the simple tools that you give that will help you become at least 64.3% more confident in talking about Jesus. That part of the 64.3%.
Exactly, 64.3%. But I think I also probably do put the disclaimer in the book that 71% of all statistics are in fact made up on the spot.
47.3% of
well, it changes. Depends on the weather.
Looking at the
oh, don't believe anything
right
you read in there. I mean, to go, good grief. I mean, to go.
Anyway, I thought that was another really, really good. You read 64.3 and you think, how does he know that? And then 47.
So all statistics are made up on the spot. It's terrible. It's just it shouldn't. Jokes like that shouldn't be allowed. It's awful. But thank you for laughing.
Well, you talk a little bit about bumper sticker theology, or what my small group leader refers to as Sunday school answers, these being the infuriatingly shallow yet correct answers Christians give probably far too often. How do we get past bumper sticker theology, Sunday school answers in our discussions amongst Christians as well as our discussions with non-Christians?
Yeah, bumper sticker theology. I mean, I use that phrase because, probably the same over there as for over here, maybe even more so because you've got a higher percentage of sort of church going. But, people who have sort of, honk if you love Jesus on the back of your car and those things, and to go, it's okay. There's nothing inherently wrong with it. But the problem is, one of the things we can sometimes get a reputation for is simplistic answers. I mean, take the suffering question we've just talked around. If someone, is really wrestling and says, man, where is God in suffering in a broken world? You can go, oh, it's okay. God's in charge. Never mind. It's all right. To go, but the frustrating thing is you're not wrong, but it is freaking simplistic. And to go, for someone who's not inside the Christian faith, it looks very simplistic. And I think that's partly what's given Christians the reputation for sometimes being airheads, really, that we take a complex issue and we just don't always think about how we're going to be heard when we come out with these kind of sound bites. I think one way to overcome it is firstly to slow right down. We've talked a bit about this. So if someone asks a question, always responding with that's a good question before you respond, even if it's a terrible question. Just be kind, because that's a good question because it matters to them. And then I think just be willing to explore it, with your friend a bit together. The more that you try and have a conversation, it's less likely you're going to bumper sticker theology. I mean, again, on the suffering piece, if you slow down and you just say, yeah, that's a tough question, isn't it? What in your own life, what's been your story with suffering? Have you had a fairly easy life, or has it been a bit tough? And then talk about yourself, and then be willing to admit where you don't know all the answers. Like on the suffering question, I think it's always very crucial. For example, as Christians, we are very, very honest. We do not know why individual people suffer. I think I can give a relatively good answer as to why there is suffering generally, but as why your grandmother died of cancer and not somebody else's, I don't know. And if we mix those up and give the impression we have confidence where we don't have knowledge, someone's going to see right through it. And also, I think, we live in an age where people want transparency a bit more. And it's interesting. I do a lot of university missions in the UK. So every year, all the campus groups on university campuses have a big mission week. It's a very traditional British thing. I don't know how it is in the States. So mission week is a big thing. So, I mean, in the last term here, probably we will have seen sort of 30, 40,000, Christians out in campuses up and down the country doing evangelism. It's brilliant. And so this year and last year at two universities I was involved with, we had an evening where we wanted to cover the suffering topic. And in both cases, what we tried, and it worked incredibly well, is rather than stand up there and give a lecture, myself and one of the other speakers sat on a sofa up the front, and we had a conversation like it was daytime TV about suffering. We talked together. And part of the brief from the students was, talk about the difference that Christian hope makes, but also be honest that as a Christian, life can still be crap. Because otherwise, if you think, if I become a Christian, everything is wonderful, and you become a Christian and everything isn't, that's one reason people then walk away from their faith, because they were missold, as it were. They were told, become a Christian, everything gets easy. Whereas actually the opposite's true, isn't it? You can sometimes become a Christian, it gets harder, because actually now everything is against you. But what we found was combining those things of our own story, the hope that Christian faith makes in the face of suffering, and then being honest about it's still tough, and a bit of testimony about how God walks with you through suffering. This year and last year, those became incredible evenings, actually, because I think we had a lot of students open up about stuff they'd gone through. We had opportunity to pray with people, and I think it was that realism component. We tried to avoid those simplistic soundbite answers. So yeah, just repeat. A soundbite. The danger of a soundbite answer, Will, is it can be correct. But as I say, to people outside the faith who haven't got the story behind the soundbite answer, it can be simplistic. And I'm struck by the fact, by the way, Jesus generally avoided soundbite answers. He loved stories. He could have given soundbites. He was capable of giving short answers, but a lot of the time he liked to tell stories because it made people think.
I feel like, especially like for young Christians, at least a lot of the Bible studies that are available for young people like us, they tend to veer towards the easy answers. And from what I can tell, it's like, well, they think if you don't give them simplistic answers, they'll leave the faith. And I'm usually of the opposite frame of mind. Like,
Yeah.
if you don't give people the real answers, if you don't wrestle through it at church, they're going to have professors that will wrestle through it with them, and they probably won't come to the same conclusions.
Absolutely correct. What I remember when I was a young Christian, one of the things I hated were those Bible study books that you'd read the passage, and then the first question would be, "What color cloak is the man wearing in verse 2?" Oh my word! My brain is going to explode with the sheer difficulty of that question. Oh my word! What do I do?
Or it's always, Jesus or the Bible is always the answer. It's like, on one hand, you're right. On another hand, let's talk about why. Let's go a little more beyond just fifth grade Sunday school. There's a guy that goes to our church, I think. I think this is where I got it from, that most people don't graduate from fifth grade Sunday school in terms of their theology. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just mature as you get older.
Yeah, and actually, I think I say to both young Christians and old Christians, actually, I think one of the best things you can do in terms of Bible study, quite frankly, is throw those terrible, pamphlets away with their silly questions, read the text, and get yourself get yourself a decent commentary. So, pick a book, pick one of the Gospels, pick Acts, ask your pastor, ask around, do an Amazon search, however it is. Find a good, introductory commentary. I mean, the British New Testament writer Tom Wright has a wonderful series called, it's the name of the Bible book, and then For Everyone, Matthew for everyone, Mark for everyone, Luke for everyone. Tom is a world-class academic, but he can write in simple terms, and just take a month or so and work through, like even and you can start young on that. So what we do in our family devotional time, most mornings before breakfast, my 11-year-old and my 8-year-old clamber into bed with my wife and I, we'll sing a couple of verses of a hymn or a chorus or something together, and then we'll crack open, we work through a book of the Bible, and right now it is Acts, and it's brilliant because you read the section, and then we just discuss together, okay, what do we notice? What struck us? What do we see? And then we just talk around it 5-10 minutes, and it's great, at their age, they can figure things out, they can see things, and if we occasionally stumble across things we don't know, my kids are quite capable of going, "Dad, what's that mean?" I go, "Do you know what? I don't know. But you know what? This is a study Bible. It's got footnotes. Let's start with the footnotes, shall we, kids?" And then you're teaching them what to do. You read the stuff at the bottom. If that doesn't work, I've got a little commentary. Let's see, what our resident expert on the shelf says about that passage. And it reminds me every morning that actually you can start really young. And as you get older, that's, I think, the way we should be primarily studying the Bible, getting into the text, not reading the text and then a set of inane questions. And do that, and pray at the start, pray that the Holy Spirit will open the eyes of your heart, and it's great fun.
Well, one last question before we wrap up. I'm looking at my stopwatch. We got about 3 minutes here.
A stopwatch, that's amazing.
In your view, what's going on with the next generation? Where is my generation at with Christianity? And what's to be done as young people about it? That's a lot to cram in there to 3 minutes. Maybe have some footnotes at the bottom of the show.
What an absolute question. Well, I also love the fact, your generation, my generation. So you've really reinforced that I'm old. I love that and I appreciate that tremendously. Well, thank you. Well, I'd say a couple of things. Firstly, I want to say I am, on the one hand, really encouraged by your generation. The fact that you guys are doing the podcast. I know others are doing YouTubing and podcasts and just getting out there. I mentioned, those 30,000 young people across our campuses who've done mission weeks. I get really excited. There are lots of Christian young people who are really going for it. And I forget who it was who said, I don't think it's a Christian quote, but I still like it. There's a great quote I've got where somebody said, "Youth was made for heroism, not for pleasure." Youth was made for heroism, not for pleasure. That's a great, I don't care it was said by a poet, I think. It's right. There's an opportunity when you're young to just get out there and put a ding in the universe. And I think we need to see more of that. So I would encourage more Christian young people, just try things out. Pray through, figure out what has God called you to. And if you're not sure, try some stuff. Try YouTubing, try apologetics, try music, try writing, try stuff. Worst will happen, you fall on your face, try something else. The joy of being young is you can afford to do that. It's the first thing. Secondly, I think there is a broader issue, isn't there, in your generation? Whereas I think, we talked about the NONESs earlier, and I think there is a disconnection from the established churches. That's the same in the UK as well. I meet more and more people of your age group who are second or third generation not Christian. They're not Christian. Their mum and dad weren't. Their grandparents weren't. They've never been to church. They're not connected at all. And on one hand, that saddens me. On the other hand, it really encourages me because you're not really dealing with angry atheists. There are a few of those around, but I would say less and less. You meet more people who are like, oh, okay, I don't know what's going on here. And especially with the multicultural mix too. So at University Mission I was doing 2 weeks ago, every night they had an international dinner. And it was amazing. On one night, I was sitting on the table full of Pakistani students, maths and engineering students who'd come over and study at this particular university. And one of them, his opening question off the bat was, he said, I've been in this country sort of 2-3 months and beginning to figure things out. He said, but Christianity, he said, I don't know much about it. So I suppose I'm a Muslim. I don't know what I am really. I guess I probably am, but I'm not sure. He said, but the Christianity, right? He said, you guys have got the Bible. He said, can I ask a question? I went, of course you can. He went, what is the Bible? I mean, what is it? I was like, what a brilliant question. He wasn't attacking it. He wasn't, the Bible has been corrupted as some Muslims do. He was like, what is it? I thought, that's a phenomenal question. And I really had to think about where do I start with that? Because if you've got someone attacking the Bible, as apologists, we might know where to begin. But this was somebody who was like, what is it? So I had to think rapidly through, okay, where do I begin and help him understand it? And then the following night, I was on a table for the Chinese and Japanese students, and the pastor of the church who was doing the international dinners, who's hosting us, did a little 5-minute devotional after the meal where he talked about the prodigal son in Luke 15 and spoke off that. And the Chinese girl next to me afterwards turned to me. She said, that's a very interesting story. I went, yeah, did you enjoy that? She went, yeah, I did. So is that in the Bible? Where did you get that from? So it's like, yes, it is actually. And it was really interesting to have two people on separate nights who knew nothing. And I think there's a lot more of that kicking around. And I think that's more so in your generation. People have got no background, and we've got to figure out in the churches how we communicate to that. And I guess the last thing I would say is the creativity piece, which we've picked on a little bit with the podcasting and the YouTubing and all that stuff. I think the challenge is always, how do you take the gospel, which doesn't change, and communicate it in fresh ways, and those ways can change. And every generation's had to do that. C.S. Lewis, name known to apologists everywhere. He said theology is the act of translation. It's taking the gospel and translating it into where we find ourselves. And I think there's both a challenge and a task and a tremendous opportunity there. And I'm looking forward to seeing what your generation come up with. I know what our generation came up with, Alpha and things like that is a product of my generation. It was great. It's still great, might have a time to run, but I'm looking forward to what's the next thing. What is the next thing that, some genius in their late teens or early 20s is going to come up with, and God's going to use it to set the world alight. So, yeah, but youth is made for heroism, not for pleasure. So live for Jesus, don't hold anything back, and just see where he uses you.
Well, we want to thank once again Dr. Andy Bannister for coming on. The book is talking about how to talk about Jesus without looking like an idiot. Andy Bannister has a great sense of humor. He is correcting my earlier mistake, a spring chicken. And it's been so fantastic to have him on the podcast. Thank you so much, Dr. Bannister.
Oh, you are welcome. You're absolutely welcome. Well, and it's great. And I love the fact that I'm realizing that you got Micah doesn't say anything. It's like Penn and Teller, isn't it? Of going, you've got he's the silent one, just nodding and smiling over there. Do you actually speak, Micah?
Yes, I do.
That's look at that. It's taken 43 minutes of a 45-minute podcast, and finally he's. I was expecting you to come up with something incredibly profound that you would sit there and digest it all. All that will do an incredibly good magic trick, like Teller. But there we go. But anyway, it's great to be with you guys, and really glad to see the podcast thriving, and you get more and more interesting guests and whatnot. So hopefully I'll be back at some point for more content, more jokes, and more of your silent partner in crime, Will.
We'd love to have you back on. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in.
Thanks for joining us on today's episode of the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast. If you enjoyed today's episode, go ahead and like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell. Also, go ahead and share with us in the comments how you found out about us. We'll see you next time on the next episode of the Rock Solid Apologia Podcast.